Hello and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be sharing all of the books that I read in February. And as I record this, there's actually a couple of days left in the month, and I'm probably gonna have my future self pop in at the end of this video to give the last couple of books that I'm in the middle of. But this was the time I had on my calendar to record, and so I wanted to do the bulk of the recording now. So you'll see a couple versions of me giving you the books that I read this month. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. Up until now, I've been able to read about 25 books. I expect to hit maybe 27 by the end of the month, with a couple that I'm in the middle of. But let me start with the ones that I've read thus far. The first one that I read in the month was a book called Always Only You. This is the second book in the Bergman Brothers series by Chloe Leese. And this series is super fun. It is a romance series that is following the lives of siblings, brothers and sisters. Eventually we do see a romance of a Bergman sister in the series as well. And in this particular book, it is about one of the brothers who's a hockey player and kind of the social media manager for his team, and they have feelings for each other and end up having a relationship. What is kind of unique about this series is that there is always some element of either like neurodiversity, or maybe a character has like a physical disability, and it's really openly addressed within the relationship of the people in the series. So I actually read a bunch of these over the course of this month. I also read the third book, which is called Ever After Always, which is one of the sisters in the family who's having trouble in her marriage, and she's trying to like work through some of these issues. Also kind of trigger warning for infertility, because that comes up in this book as well. I also picked up the fourth book called With You Forever. This is about one of the male brothers who's an artist and also has some neurodiversity, and a good friend of his brother's girlfriend. It will be hard to kind of map all of these things, but kind of someone who's been like a dear friend of his family, and they begin to have a relationship. There's also book 5, which I got to this month as well, called Everything for You. And this is about one of the brothers who is gay, who's also a hockey player, and no, sorry, he's a soccer player. They're all into sports in different ways, and is in a relationship with someone on his team. So all of those I kind of binged this past month because I've just really enjoyed this series. There is a 6th one coming out soon, and I will definitely be picking it up. I think it comes out in April of this year. Next up, I read one of Emily Henry's backlist called People We Meet on Vacation. This is one of the books that I had not gotten to yet. I had read A Beach Read, and I don't remember all of the titles, but I've read several of her books and really enjoyed them. This is basically a book about two friends that meet in college and then go on vacations together throughout the years, and are definitely dealing with kind of a certain level of sexual tension between as they kind of get older and they start to want to be more in a relationship with each other, a romantic relationship, and really enjoyed it. I really like Emily Henry's work, so that was a fun one to pick up. Next, I read TheFixerUpper by Lauren Forsyth. And this is a book about a woman who kind of struggles to be in a relationship, but when the men that she's with in her relationship leave, they always leave with like for the better. Like they have gained skills, or they've moved on to something in their lives that they were like aspiring to do. And so she has this kind of reputation of like fixing up the people that she's with, but then they don't stay with her. And so in this particular book, and I think it's a standalone, I don't think it's a series, but in this book, she has almost like a business that she sets up to kind of help women fix up their partners. And she ends up getting hired by kind of this social media darling, someone who's kind of an influencer. And her boyfriend is someone that the woman who's the fixer-upper knows from her past. And the story goes on from there. I also really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really fun. And I picked it up just kind of randomly from my library and was glad that I picked it up to read. The next book that I read is one called Good Girl, Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. This is the second book in a series called A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. And I think when I talked about this in the TBR video earlier this month, I thought it took place when she was in college, and she's still in high school in this particular book. But it definitely follows on the first book, and the first book storyline is very important to what happens in the second book, because she becomes kind of famous for her role in the first book. I would definitely recommend reading these books in order, but it's basically a high school student who is solving crimes. And I find it to be really charming. I love the audio, would highly recommend this one as well. Next, I picked up The Dating Plan, which is the second book in the Marriage Game series by Sarah Desai. I picked up this book explicitly because it was a book of the month. So this is one of my book of the month challenge books that I'm kind of reading that backlist. And I read the first book, I think last month, which was called The Marriage Game, I think. And then this is The Dating Plan. It's basically about women who are kind of navigating cultures that are around arranged marriages, and they're kind of working within their family structures to find a partner with this kind of idea of an arranged marriage possibility in the background of the story. I would say that this book stood out to me because of those cultural components, and I found them to be really interesting. But otherwise, you know, this wasn't like a real standout for me in terms of like the characters or the plotting of the book. I don't know that I'm going to pick up another in the series. I just kind of challenged myself to get to this one. And glad that I read it just because it's an interesting take on the romance genre. So that again was The Dating Plan by Sarah Desai. All right, next I picked up a book called Mad Honey. This is a book that is co-written by Jodi Picoult and Jennifer Finney Boylan. And I will just say, I don't want to give any spoilers here, but I knew going into the book something that was going to be a major part of the plot line because I have familiarity with the co-author of Jodi Picoult, Finney Boylan, and what that person often writes about. If you don't want to have any spoilers, don't look up the second author. Like don't look up and find out anything about that person, because I knew going in, I was like, oh, if they're co-writing this, it must be about X topic. And sure enough, it was like, and this is kind of the thing that's meant to be like the twist in the book. And so I just completely saw it coming, you know, like I from like page one, like I knew that this is going to be a part of the book. So I would just say, if you already know this author, you've already guessed the twist. But if you don't, you know, and you want to go into this with kind of blind and not knowing what the twist is going to be, just don't do any research on the second author and you'll be fine. Otherwise, the book was very well done. I always enjoy Jodi Picoult books. I think they're always fascinating. There was kind of a courtroom drama aspect to this one, which she does very well. And it's basically about two teenagers who are a couple, and the girl dies, and the boy is basically brought up on charges for being part of her death. Trigger warning for domestic violence, because that comes up several times in the story. And I always love this author, and both of these authors actually, and I would pick up pretty much anything that they wrote, and especially when they write together. So it was fun to see them doing that. Okay, next up, I picked up a book called Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. And this is a book that I picked up because I had just like heard interesting things about it. I think this book has also been adapted, if I remember correctly. And it's basically about kind of a man and a woman who are married, and the man ends up having kind of an affair with someone that he works with. And the woman that he's having the affair with then befriends the wife. So there's kind of this like triangle that's happening between these three characters. I will just say this book took a very weird turn. And I don't want to say much more than that, just because I don't want to give away anything. I don't even want to give away like the theme of like the turn that it takes. It's kind of it's a genre twist in terms of like what the book is doing. And I wasn't expecting it. And I ended up like looking up online to see, does the show do the same thing? Like, does it also take this kind of weird turn? You just can't see it coming. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, interesting. Like, I mean, it's just like it's a weird turn that the book takes. I mean, I would recommend the book. I thought it was well done. I thought it was interesting. I listened to it on audio. I wanted to keep going. Like, I wanted to kind of know what was happening with this book. But it definitely has like this interesting twist that I don't know that I like, if this author is kind of known for doing that kind of writing, I don't know that I would pick up another book. Hard for me to say more without giving something away. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Okay, this month I also picked up Fleischmann is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. This was another book I picked up because it was being adapted, and it's basically about a modern relationship between a man and a woman who are divorced, and they're both kind of very high-profile professional with like strong careers, and the wife kind of disappears, or the ex-wife rather, and the dad and the father is kind of left to take care of their children, and he doesn't really know what's happened to her, and so it's kind of an excavation of like their relationship and how it came to be, and what happened to the relationship up to the point in the book when they kind of go their separate ways. I have seen people rave about this book. I've also seen people not really enjoy this book. I thought it was fine. I actually thought it was really well done, but I feel like it's also kind of the thing that people probably don't like is it feels a little too on the nose in terms of just like modern relationships and like critiques of modern relationships, especially among people with wealth. And this takes place in New York, so it has kind of some elements of just kind of like urban life and urban wealth that I think are maybe kind of passé to certain people. Like they just don't feel like it's very interesting. So I would definitely like recommend it if that kind of sounds interesting to you. If you like books that have like a deeper dive on a relationship, it might be something to check out. Okay, then I picked up a book called One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This is a young adult novel that is basically a kind of fairy tale. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. The book is basically a world building book about a girl who survives this illness that leaves her with a kind of magic. And she kind of meets up with this group of people that are trying to collect these cards. And if they collect all the cards, they can like break the magic spell, basically. I'm kind of simplifying the situation, but basically that's what's going on. And so she starts to help them because part of her magic is that she can kind of see these cards. And she's trying to help them get all the cards so that they can break the spell. There are people in this world who are also trying to find all the people who survived this illness and kill them, basically, because they think that magic should be controlled. And so she's also hiding the fact that she has this magic from the majority of the people around her. I really, really enjoyed this book. It is the first in a series called The Shepherd King, and I will definitely pick up the next one. The first book really sets you up for kind of what's happening in the next book, and I think it's coming out in the next couple of months. So that one was really fun, and I really enjoyed it. Next up, I picked up a book called The Most Likely Club by Alyssa Friedland. And this is a book about a group of women who had kind of these superlatives in high school of like being most likely to, and they get to midlife and they kind of realize that they're not achieving those dreams. And so they start to support each other and they kind of come back together around a reunion and start to move each other kind of toward the dreams that they originally had when they were teenagers. I love books about women empowering other women. So this one was a really fun one and I enjoyed that. Okay, then throughout the month, I kind of dipped in and out of Beth O'Leary's The Road Trip. This is a book that I really, really liked for so many reasons. One is that it goes back and forth between like past and present. And basically what has happened is there is a man and a woman and they were in a relationship and they broke up. And they end up getting stuck in a car driving to a wedding together with 3 other people. And through their interactions in this car and kind of flashing back to how they originally got together, you understand what was going on in their relationship and why they eventually broke up. And, you know, you kind of understand the history. There were several moments of this book that were just laugh out loud funny. And there was also just this really wonderful way of describing how these people were in the past, because everybody who's in the car, most people, 4 of the 5 people in the car, we see in the past story, and then you see them in the present, and they've all had these like life transitions and changes that are just really interesting to see how they've matured over several years. And it feels very true to each character that they would have matured in these particular ways. So I really, really liked this one. I feel like there were some people who didn't like it and I wasn't sure why. Like I just really enjoyed the back and forth. I think some people when you have a back and forth like that, they prefer one story over the other, but I actually thought they were really well balanced. And so this is one I would probably read again, and I would also highly recommend it. Okay, then I picked up a book called Judas 62 by Charles Cumming. This is the second book in the Box 88 series, which is basically about a guy who's in kind of like an MI5/CIA like our organization that is basically doing various things, including espionage and things like that. This book, I liked the first book in the series more than I liked the second book in the series. And partly it's because the way that the book opens in this, and this is not giving away a spoiler, basically there are people who are being assassinated. They're kind of being uncovered as being agents, and then there is a group that is assassinating them. And the main character is kind of brought in to try to like figure out what's going on with this. That part I was totally on board with. But then the story goes like back in time to like one of his early cases in Russia, and the majority of the book, like 95% of the book, is all about this past experience. It's not about the present day situation. And this is what the first book did as well. This is kind of like a trope of what this author is doing, is it like sets up a modern day thing, and then it takes you into the past so you can understand kind of the situation of how the modern day thing came to be. But when you do that kind of back and forth, I prefer that you have more time in the modern day, and it's not just kind of the story of the history. You don't just like set up the history and then that's the entire book. I like to see the interplay between the two. So the book was well done. You know, I like what this author is doing, but it just didn't hit right for me in terms of the balance between past and present that I think could have been a really good element of this book. Okay, then I picked up Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules at Work and in Life by Francesca Gino. This was one of the Alphabet Challenge books that I had from the last month. I was interested in this book because I saw Francesca Gino give a keynote on a similar topic, and I knew that she had published this book. And basically this is about people who go against the grain, like in their careers, in their decision making, and how that can actually increase their positivity or like their impact like within their careers. And lots of really good examples provided throughout this book. And I love books like that where it's all about like the examples and how this is like directly applied to people's careers and lives. All right, then I picked up Alice Feeney's Rock, Paper, Scissors, another Alphabet Challenge book. This is a thriller about a couple who are going on a trip together, and you're set up from the very beginning that they're basically lying to each other, but you don't know why, and you don't really trust either one of them as a narrator. There's a nice little twist that happens a good portion of the way through the book that I thought was great, and I totally didn't see coming. And it was really atmospheric, and I think this is like perfect for like, I don't know, sometimes a good thriller is like a good summer read, but like a fall kind of dark, wintry read, because it takes place in a like snowy village. Really, really like that one. I think this might be my first or second that I've read by Alice Feeney, and I'll definitely pick up others from her as well. Okay, next up I read All the Dangerous Things by Stacey Willingham, and this is a book also that has an unreliable narrator, because there is a narrator who is dealing with insomnia, and so it's unclear throughout the book like if her perception of events is accurate in terms of what she's experiencing. And there's also a subplot in this book. Basically she has her toddler son goes missing, and she is going around to like true crime festivals and conferences, like telling the story of this to try to keep his case alive. And when she goes to one of these, she's approached by a podcaster who does true crime podcasting, and this person wants her to come on his show. And of course we find out, you know, throughout their engagements together what has happened to her toddler son. So definitely trigger warning for child in peril. And I think that this one, there's nothing kind of graphic about the child in peril, but I know that's sensitive for some people in terms of what people choose to read. I liked this. I thought it was interesting. I thought it had a lot of elements to it that were unique in terms of what the author was kind of trying to bring together in terms of like the subplot about the podcast and things like that. Okay, next up, I read a book called How We Live is How We Die by Pema Chodron. Pema Chodron is a Buddhist nun. I think she's in her 80s now, and she lives in an abbey. in Canada, if I remember correctly. And she often writes about things like difficulty, change, uncertainty, and I really, really love her work. All that said, this book is, I would say, a more technical work in that it is like really looking at some very specific Buddhist literature and giving like an analysis of this Buddhist literature and kind of applying it. One of the things I've liked about the other works by Pema Chodron is how she brings in like real life examples and helps you to see how kind of Buddhist instruction can be applied to actual real life. That is happening a lot less in this book. However, I think I rated it like 5 stars just because I feel like from a technical perspective, it's really well done. I would definitely not recommend it for like the average person who has very little background in kind of the Buddhist religion or different kind of systems within Buddhism, because I think it would be hard to follow and I don't think it would be super interesting. But I love Pema Chodron and I'll pretty much read everything she writes. So take that for what you will, but I would maybe start with something else that she's done because it's probably a little bit more accessible. Okay, next up I read a book called What Lies in the Woods by Kate Ellis Marshall. Kate Ellis Marshall also wrote another book that I loved, and I think it's called I Am Alive. I know I talked about it on the last video, and so I was very hopeful about this book. This is her first adult fiction book. I think that it reads like a first adult fiction book. There's nothing necessarily wrong or bad about the book, but I ended up rating it like 3 stars. I felt like it was okay. Everything hung together, like the plot made sense and the character development was fine. But I feel like she's gonna, in like her next book, if she continues to do adult fiction, the next one is gonna be better. Like you're gonna see her get better over time. The young adult book was like a 5-star read to me. It was incredible. So I know she has it in her to do like incredible kind of plotting and really interesting storylines. The general premise of this book is that there are some girls who, when they are kind of adolescents, they end up like testifying against this man and sending him to prison for being a killer. And one of these girls gets attacked in the woods and basically says it was this man, but she didn't actually see him. And so she sent this guy to prison, but it might not actually be this guy. And now she's like trying to figure out with these other 2 girls that were in the woods with her what happened. And I don't want to give too much away because there's definitely some spoilers here that happen pretty early in the book that are impactful for the plot. And I'm actually just really excited for this author's next adult fiction book because I think it's going to be probably really incredible. Next up, I picked up True Biz by Sarah Novick, and what a fun read this book was. This is a book that really centers around the deaf community, and it is about a woman who is hearing but is the headmistress of a deaf school and who is partnered with someone who is deaf and whose mother is deaf, so she grew up in a deaf household. It's about a young girl in the deaf school who grew up in a hearing household and was given a cochlear implant that basically meant she had very little access to the deaf community when she was growing up. And then it's also about another character, a boy, a teenager in the school who grew up in a deaf family. His father is hearing, his mother is deaf, and they have just had a baby, like a new baby, and the baby is hearing. And so there's kind of these interesting kind of cultural moments between the deaf community and the hearing community. The book basically goes back and forth between their 3 perspectives and culminates in kind of some things that happen towards the end of the book. The book also includes like these little snippets about like American Sign Language, Black Sign Language, various different kinds of ways of communicating within the deaf community, almost like little textbook snippets if you were like in a class learning about this. And if you know nothing about the deaf community, this I think is a really interesting introduction because it lays out a lot of the politics of the deaf community and a lot of the kind of inner workings that we just don't often think of if you're part of a hearing community. So that was one that I just heard great things about. I was so glad that I picked it up. Really enjoyed that. Next up, I read a book called When in Rome by Sarah Adams, and this is a pretty typical small town romance. about a woman who is a like famous singer, and she decides to go to a small town called Rome in like the southern US. I don't even remember which state it's in. And she basically meets this guy who owns a bakery, and they start to have a relationship. I would say, like, while I enjoyed this book, very common tropes. And I thought it was well written, but it doesn't really stand out to me in terms of other romances that I've read that are a little bit more creative. All right, next up I read a book called The Murder Rule by Dervla McTiernan. This is an author I had never read before, and the thing that actually I'm most taking away from this particular book is that I like the author's style. This book didn't necessarily feel like a book for me. Like, there were several things that I just, I don't know, like, it didn't kind of hook me in, but I would absolutely read this author's series, because there's another series that this author writes that I have never encountered before. And I think that she's really talented, but this particular book, like, it just didn't hit for me. So basically it's about a woman who is joining like an innocence project where she's trying to help people who are on death row, but she has kind of her own agenda for why she's doing it, and it's rooted in kind of her mother's history. So the story goes back and forth between her mother's history and what her situation is. And I don't know, like I feel like sometimes when I listen to an audiobook, like sometimes it really grabs me and sometimes it doesn't. And it's not necessarily about the narrator. It's usually about like the plot and kind of how it's kind of unfolding. So this one didn't really grab me, but I also like am very intrigued by this author, and will probably check out some other things she's written just to see what I think. Okay, next up, I read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, this is a book that is being adapted. Everyone is talking about it. Everybody is rereading it right now. I think the adaptation comes out on like March 2nd. It is like the thing that everybody is talking about on social media. And so I had never read this book. The other thing I had heard about this book was that it is phenomenal on audio. So I was waiting for it to come in on audio from my library, and it did. And I totally understand why people love the audio for this book. It is a full cast. It is basically a like oral history of a band in the 60s, a fictional band in the 60s, or maybe the 70s, where it's the 70s, where the band like comes together, and then they are in a band together, and then they break up. And so there's all these different characters kind of telling the story of the band and how the band came to be, and then how the band and in the end breaks up. This book, it is like it's a real band. I mean, like there were moments in this book where they talk about like where the band performs, and like these very like historical moments of the band where I was like, oh, it just gave me like goosebumps to think about like people who could have seen this band perform, and it's not even a real band. I just thought the Taylor Jenkins Reid wrote this in such a powerful way. There is a little bit of a twist, you know, towards the end of the book, which I thought was like fun, but not even necessary, because the whole thing was just like so well done. I'm totally going to watch the adaptation. I'm really curious to see how it gets kind of done in that. And my understanding is the author also wrote an entire album of like lyrics that accompany this book. And so I'm just really curious to see how the music actually comes out in the adaptation, because it's obviously not in the audiobook, but highly, highly, highly recommend it. I do think like the hype is very real. This is a really good book. Okay. And then the most recent book that I read, but probably not my last read for the month. The most recent book I read is called Remain Silent. This is the third book in the D.S. Manon Bradshaw series, which is basically about a detective sergeant. In the beginning of the series, she's like a single woman. Then she becomes a single mother. Now she's partnered and has a couple of kids. And one of the most wonderful things about this series is how real she is about being a working mom, basically, and how it's so challenging for her to balance what's going on at home with what's going on at work, and how she's like navigating the politics of being a working mom. It's very real. And I think a lot of mysteries focus on like the crime, or it's not about like the actual detective so much. And in this one, and it's rare when it is about the detective that it's a female detective, and that you're seeing her kind of balancing all the aspects of like the difficulties of normal life with everything she's doing in her job. And you see that a lot more in this particular book. This story follows the death by hanging of an immigrant, and they're trying to figure out if it was a suicide or if it was murder. And I definitely would say read these books in order, because the character development of Man and Bradshaw is significant over the first couple of books, and then this is the third in the series. I think this came out a couple of years ago, so I'm really curious to see if there's a fourth one that the author is going to do for this as well. So if I read additional books, this is where I'm going to drop into the video of the books that I was able to finish additionally this month. All right, I'm popping in to talk about the last two books that I read for the month of February, which I ended up finishing after the last video. So the first book is called TheThree by Sarah Lotz, and this is a book that basically is about a series of plane crashes that happen. There's 4 plane crashes that all happen around the same time, and 3 of those plane crashes result in 1 child survivor from each of the plane crashes. And these child survivors, there's all these like conspiracy theories that like arise about the fact that they survived. And some of them are more like religious-based conspiracy theories, like this is like the sign of the apocalypse. Others were more like alien kinds of conspiracy theories. And the book basically covers like the story of these 3 survivors and how the world kind of reacts to them. And the plane crashes happen in different countries, so they're not all in the same geographical location. And these children end up having to be kind of like protected from society, and they have this like meaning around them because of these plane crashes. I will say that there was a section of this book that got into kind of a little bit of like religious fanaticism that was not as interesting to me, but I loved how the book wrapped up. And I thought it was super interesting, and it was just the kind of book that I love to read in terms of how it closed out. So I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in, I wouldn't even know what to describe. I mean, it's basically like a cultural reaction to these kinds of events that happen in this book. Okay, and then the last book that I read for the month was Red Shirts by John Scalzi. This was one of my Alphabet Challenge books, and I read it right under the wire and finished it on the last day of the month. And this is basically kind of a tribute. I hesitate to call it fan fiction, but it is kind of fan fiction for Star Trek. And basically, John Scalzi is writing about a situation in which, and this one is tough because I'm not sure what's a spoiler and what's not a spoiler. Basically, like, he is writing a story about what he's calling the red shirts on Star Trek, which is basically the people who are killed off, and they aren't main characters on the show. And it's basically this concept of, like, if you're a red shirt, you're under more risk to be killed off in the show. And what basically ends up happening is the red shirts on the show kind of start to understand this pattern, and it opens up their eyes to something that's kind of happening, and then everything else would give away a spoiler. So I would say it's very funny. It's meant to be very light and kind of comedic, and it has kind of these interesting, I think he calls them like codas at the end of the book, which is basically like 3 of the characters, you get like a deeper story within like these mini chapters at the end of the book. I'm definitely glad I read it. I've read other books by John Scalzi that are not Star Trek related that I also really enjoyed. And so this was a really fun one to pick up. And now back to the earlier version of myself to close out the video. Those are all the books that I was able to read in the month of February. And you can look out for my March TBR video coming soon, where I'm going to outline all of the books I'm hoping to read in the month of March. Always a really wonderful set of books, and so glad that I was able to get through so many this month. And please feel free to drop in the comments below if there are any books you read in the past month that you want me to check out or that you think might be interesting. I'm always interested in hearing what you're reading as well. And until next month, happy reading.